Thank you for listening to Footnotes, a Fellowship Mosaic podcast. This is a space for us to dig deeper into Scripture, what is happening in our community and culture, and continue the conversations we start on Saturday nights. We are excited to have you join us as we pursue truth, holiness, and redemption together. Hey everyone, welcome back to Footnotes. This is Ashley Covert, and I'm joined right now with Collin Jackson.
Hey everyone.
Collin, how's it going?
It's going well.
Good. Hey, we are going to circle back to Collin's teach over the Transfiguration.
Mm-hmm.
Collin, walk us through some of the points that you made, some of the points that you didn't get to touch on, and help our folks do a little deeper dive.
Yeah, so we walked through, we had a family service. It was really fun if you got to be a part of it with us. If you didn't, you should go back. This was one of my favorite teachings in Mark, and I really enjoyed it. Our boys, I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old now. That's crazy. And this story is actually one of our favorite stories in the Biggest Storybook Bible by Kevin DeYoung. And it's just this idea that all this Old Testament layers of glory and faces that are shining and people receiving authority and dominion and God on top of mountains, and that all of them come together on this mountain where Jesus is transfigured and he's changed and his face is shining as bright as the sun. And Peter is like, we should build some tents because it's like what they did in the Exodus. But all of it is disrupted in this voice in the cloud where God the Father speaks and says, this is my son, listen to him. And so, that was kind of where we left it. But there's still so much more we could talk about. A lot of layers to why is Jesus' face shining? Why are Moses and Elijah there? What do they talk about coming down the mountain, like the feasts? And so many layers.
Yeah, a lot happened on that mountain.
A lot happened. Yeah, and falling out of and flow with Mark chapter 8, we see that Jesus is referred to very clearly and speaks. It says he speaks plainly to his disciples, telling them who he is, exactly who his identity is. So in Mark 8 and 9, you really are seeing this building point throughout the Gospel of Mark that is just very clearly showing the identity of Jesus. And so in Mark 9, Peter declares, you are the Messiah. And good job, Pete. You did something really well. And then Jesus, this is 8:31. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And I love 32. Mark just says, and Jesus spoke plainly about this to them, but then Peter took him aside and rebuked him. So now we see Peter coming back around and not quite getting it. But that title, Son of Man, carries significant weight in the Hebrew Scriptures. Mm-hmm. It is speaking to all the way back in Daniel. As we talked about, where you have all these visions of God's glory and someone like a man is receiving authority or dominion. The Son of Man speaks to the Messiah, the King, the anointed one that God has chosen, who is a man. He's a human. And so Jesus is claiming, this is who I am. I am that King. I am that anointed one. But then you get, as if that wasn't big enough of his identity shift. Then you come to Mark 9, we're up the mountain, his face is glowing, as bright as the sun, his clothes are radiating, and Elijah and Moses are talking to him. And in all of that, this cloud comes, and we hear for the second time now, we heard it at the baptism, that spoke very clearly of Jesus' identity. And now for a second time we hear, this is my son who I love. Listen to him. So not only is this the Son of Man, the messianic figure, apparently this messianic figure is God himself in the flesh. And so we hear that term Son of God, and you get some really weird stuff in church history where people are talking about God having babies and mating and no, that's not at all what it's speaking to. His deity, the fact that he is divine, he has the same nature and essence of God. So a lot of the early church heresies come down to one of these two not being held. Either he's just a man who earned himself deity, or he's just a man and not deity, or he's only deity and his humanity is like something that's like a shell or a shadow. And so you see very quickly early in the church, a lot of the false teachings that take place don't hold to both of those being a reality for us. And so Jesus is saying in these passages, or what Mark is pointing to, is Jesus is fully man and he's fully God, and to separate those would be a false Christ. It'd be a different Jesus.
Yeah, definitely. It's hard for us to wrap our mind around now. I can't imagine how difficult it was even when Jesus was standing there saying these truths about himself, for them to understand it. And I think we'll see later in this passage when Peter and James and John are walking down the mountain discussing what it means to rise from the dead.
No, totally.
Jesus is laying it out pretty clearly, like Mark said, and they're still struggling to wrap their mind around it. And they don't fully get it until they see it happen.
Yeah, like, and to their credit, like some of these guys they're just like fishermen. Like maybe they have some Torah or some understanding, in their education system, but some of this is like really hard stuff to fathom too. Like he's fully God, fully man. Like that's easy to like sign off on, but to like truly fathom the mystery of that, like that's part of why I'm so compelled to be a follower of Jesus. Is like there's so much mystery and beauty in this.
Yeah, and they've seen some of that mystery revealed in the miracles that he's done, but they still struggle to wrap their heads around it, which totally. I think is what always points us back to faith being part of faith, and choosing to believe even when we can't always fully understand it. But let's go back to the mountain.
Yeah.
We've got Moses and Elijah up there.
Awesome.
Why are they there?
That's a great question. First off, you son of man, you hear son of man, and what comes to mind for you?
Yeah. I am a millennial, so I hear son of man. And as much as I would like to think that I think of Jesus first, I do think of Disney's Tarzan first. And a really banging soundtrack that Phil Collins just went so hard on.
Can we sing on here? I don't think we can sing on
here. I don't think they want us to sing on here.
Yeah, the Moses-Elijah thing is fascinating. And I think there's a lot of ways you could take it. St. John Chrysostom, old saint. I've loved quoting old saints on this one. They've done a lot of the work for us. But, St. John of Chrysostom, he explains the presence of these two historic, early, foundational figures in the Old Testament in three ways. There's kind of three ways we could look at it. One, Moses and Elijah are there because they represent the law and prophets. So Moses comes down his mountain experience with the law, the Torah, the way in which God's people are to live. And then Elijah represents, he's a great prophet among many other prophets, but even the way he comes down his mountain experience with God and then passes off the same prophetic ministry to Elisha. And that continues the line of prophets. And so there's one train of thought that says Jesus is Moses and Elijah are the representation of the entire Old Testament, with the law and the prophets pointing to Christ. That's one view. Awesome. I love it. The second one is that there's some hyperlinks and parallels to their mountaintop experiences that were really significant, where Moses is on the mountain, face glowing, coming down, and the people are terrified and don't understand. Similar, Elijah hears God's voice in a cloud and comes down ready to continue the work. And there's even some cool parallels between some of the things. Elijah comes down and then gives his ministry to be carried on for someone else and then is taken up in a flaming chariot. And there's even some cool parallels potentially you could find to it's foreshadowing even Christ and when he comes down and passes on the ministry, the kingdom. But so that their experiences. So one is that the text itself points to Jesus, which is awesome. The second is just the parallels between their experiences. It's great. This one's kind of fun that it doesn't get talked about a lot, but it is held to, is the idea that Elijah and Moses are actually a representation of the living and the dead, that both are in submission to the Messiah. And And that one kind of gives me chills when I think about it, that Elijah living, like, didn't die, taken up in a chariot. And then Moses did die. We don't know exactly where he's buried. Like, God even keeps that a mystery, but he did die. And so here you have a person who is living, like, didn't die, and a person who did die, and both are standing with the Messiah, with the Son of God in the flesh, Jesus himself. And so what you see is, like, within which of those views is correct? Yes, I think all three can be held, but regardless of which one you kind of want to say is the one, I think all three have some value. The point is the fact that in this mountain, we have Jesus as he exists all the time, where his heavenly, divine nature and his human nature are both just being perfectly shown in this overlap, where now we have, regardless of if living or dead, people that are from the past as well as disciples in the current are both seeing all things point to him. So I think why Moses and Elijah there, I think it's really there to affirm that, hey, the entire Old Testament story has been pointing to him. And why James and John and Peter? Because the ones who are going to carry that on through the church in the New Testament are also pointing to him. So there's this beautiful overlap between Old Testament prophets and soon-to-be apostles of the church, all encountering the authentic Christ and his glory.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm a pretty visual person, and so I think of a Venn diagram of Old Testament, Moses and Elijah, New Testament, Peter, James, and John. The Venn diagram holding it all together in the center is Jesus.
Yes.
The embodiment of both throughout the history of time. One of the things in the service that was really cool, because it was a family service and we had all of our kids in the room. I was sitting over by the kids choir when they were off stage, and when we did our breaking point to have conversations of who would you take up a mountain with you and what would that experience be like for you, one of the first questions that the kids I was next to asked was, how did they even know it was Moses and Elijah?
Yeah.
And the text doesn't, fully go into the introductions of Jesus saying, hey, Peter, meet Moses, Moses, meet James. We don't get that part, but it gave me a cool perspective of just thinking through, if you've got kids and kids in your life that you haven't had these discussions with about these stories, man, really, really do it, because their thought process is different than ours. And so it shapes cool questions and continues the conversation. And just opens the door to discipleship. So that was a really cool point.
Yeah, and there's so many good questions there that you could. The text isn't clear, at least not Mark. Luke gives a few more in his account on the Transfiguration. Like, he actually tells us what Moses and Elijah and Jesus were talking about. His exodus. He's about to go have an exodus in Jerusalem, speaking towards how he's about to have his own death and resurrection that's going to bring about new liberation and freedom, and then through his kingdom. But yeah, like, how do we recognize them? There's so many layers too of, like, what does it actually look like if Jesus' face is like shining like lightning? And again, I think the language is intentional to what Luke and Mark were writing. But how do you even keep your eyes open that long? And right. So I think it does lean towards, there's a lot of mystery. And that's part of why I'm so compelled to follow Jesus is, his beauty, his glory. He's putting on display. I mean, Hebrews would say he is the radiance and the exact imprint and image of God. And that's somebody I want to follow.
Yeah, absolutely. It does make me think of sort of pop culture, Jesus pop culture God, and the depiction of guy in all white robes and big long beard. I wonder if some of that imagery was maybe pulled from the Transfiguration and just the language of his clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them.
Yes.
And wonder what parts of the text we pull to assign imagery to.
Yeah, totally. Well, and again, if you're just reading that text, you're like, that's weird and kind of lame. If you look at the entire, again, the scriptures are a collection. It's a library. It's telling. So where else in the scripture do we see dazzling white clothes? And if you start to pull that thread, you find like, oh my gosh, like this is is all over the place. Even as you get into the Revelation where John is seeing not only a person whose face is on fire and glowing on a throne, and he's dazzling, bleach white, and you also see saints, like all the saints are wearing there's something to like colors and symbols that I think if we just look at like if you take it, you're just like, yeah, so that's what God's like. He's just a white, really shining dude with a beard on a throne. It's like, well, but if you can look at it, the grand scheme, like all of Scripture, and yeah,
for sure. And I think even if the disciples didn't have the understanding of what they were seeing, they knew it was significant.
Totally.
Peter goes on to say in verse 5, Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters for you. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. So help unpack that for me in just a second. One of the things that it makes me think of is just the humanity he was bringing to that moment, and reflecting on my own humanity in being in a situation that feels pretty overwhelming. And my immediate response and reaction is to take action, to do something tangible, rather than to just sit and be holding space or sharing presence with people. So walk me through what the 3 shelters idea was about.
Yeah. So Chad Bird has done a lot of good research on this, but if you look at all of the feasts throughout Israel, so they have all these different feasts that they're doing. We actually have a study. Carrie Tucker and Melissa Church, 2 of our spiritual leaders, have written on biblical feasts. You should ask them about it. It's really good. But throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus doing significant things at some of the different times of those feasts. And so the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, to tabernacle meant to have a tent or a dwelling place. And it's a callback to when God himself came and dwelled at Sinai, back to Moses' glory. And they tabernacled together. They had a tent where Moses is meeting with God face to face as one meets with a friend, and then it became a place to remember and to celebrate. We're going to set up this entire Feast of Tabernacles where we remember living in tents with God's glory dwelling with us. And so it would make sense Peter, being a good Jew, would go, oh yeah, like God's glory is dwelling here. So like, yeah, let's get some tents going. But both Luke and Mark say, like, he very clearly doesn't know what he's talking about, because he's like, I guess let's get Moses a tent, and we'll get John a tent, and everyone gets a tent. But it's something to the significance of Jesus is everything that the Feast of Tabernacles is pointing to. Again, just like everything else in the Scriptures, it's pointing to him. We don't need a tent anymore. The glory of God in full display is existing in and through Christ.
Yeah.
Fully God, fully man. And here we're seeing we don't need tents anymore, which is, again, if you watch what Jesus does, he comes down, and there's such a big deal in that day for the temple. And one of the very first things that Jesus does is goes and flips tables in the temple and says, we've taken this dwelling place for God, and it's become a den of robbers. And so there's something really significant to the Feast of Tabernacles that Jesus is showing here, like, we don't need tents anymore. And even then, if you follow it through the rest of the New Testament, where he gives his Spirit and the living temple in and through the church, they are living stones now that are not limited to a building. It's a people. So, and then, yeah, why Elijah? Like, what's the deal? I mean, Peter, if you keep reading in Mark 9, they start to have some questions about Elijah coming first. And yeah, there's a lot there that I'm fine to say I don't know. Nick Rowland does. But I do think there's something to, some people were saying John the Baptist was this forerunner for Jesus. Not that he was. He is the forerunner that was preparing the way for Jesus. And there were people who were saying that John the Baptist might be Elijah reincarnate, and this idea of, because he was taken up, John the Baptist is doing things like Elijah, kind of like a prophet. Maybe he is Elijah. And so there's all these like debates, even about Jesus and his identity. And Jesus just seems to dispel those and says, hey, Elijah has come as the forerunner for me. Now, whether he's talking about that being John the Baptist, or whether he's talking about, hey, you just saw Elijah on the mountain. He's come, and now we're getting started. We're going. Yeah, I don't fully understand. I don't know if there's one way to take that, but I think again it points to the disciples are still, they're circling it, but they're still not quite getting that this idea that Jesus is the Son of Man. He is the Messiah. They're admitting that, and he's also the Son of God who's come to lay down his life for many.
Definitely. And I think, we see in the passage, Jesus is really trying to drive that point home, because after Peter is talking about the shelters, then a cloud appears and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son, whom I love, listen to him." Then in verse 8, suddenly when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. So Jesus is emphasizing the point. It's not about Moses and Elijah. It's about me. I'm here right now. We're moving forward. Here's the passing of the baton from the old to the new, in a sense, with Old Testament prophet and law to New Testament going to be apostles, starting the church. But I can only imagine that, again, in this really crazy, overwhelming day that Peter, James, and John are having with a cloud, a voice, and a disappearing act, that our finite minds are doing everything we can to understand and to rationalize. And there just comes a point where there is no rationalizing with what our own human understanding is capable of.
Yeah.
There's just accepting. And that can be a real struggle for people who, very similar to myself, are linear, logical thinkers. So there's comfort for me in seeing and reading about kind of the struggle of understanding that these disciples had, even though they were the ones who walked with him for 3 years and witnessed his miracles and witnessed him after he rose from the dead, and giving myself some grace as well to kind of wrestle through the things that I can't rationalize.
Yeah, the Dallas Theological Seminary defines theology as faith seeking understanding. We have this belief and this commitment, not just a belief, but a trust. And now we're seeking to understand it and know it more. And we have a God who reveals himself. He can be understood. And so there's something really beautiful to, not just with the Transfiguration, but any time we come to a text that God's revealing himself. And there's something in there for us to trust and to hold to and commit to, but also to seek to understand.
Totally. Well, setting us up for this coming weekend, we've got another entrance for Jesus. We'll be in Mark 11, and we'll see all kinds of symbolism laid out in this text as well. Nate's going to teach on it, where we see Jesus coming into Jerusalem with a colt and some
like a donkey, not like a colt, as in like a
not a C-U-L-T.
I know, I heard that and I was like, it's
but a C-O-L-T. He's coming in with a young colt.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to see where our story continues to take us. But yeah, anything else to wrap this one up?
Let's listen to Jesus. Fully God, fully man, and there's no one else worth giving your affection and attention towards. So may you listen to him well today, and may we go in love to serve the Lord.
Amen. We love you, Mosaic. See you next time.